Okay, this is just a quick guide to how to give yourself a chance of getting in the higher bands for either of the literature exams. So really aimed at supporting those students who are trying to get to a star in literature. And in many respects, the skills that you need for the poetry exam and for the modern text Unit 1 exam are very similar in terms of developed and effective analysis. So if I go through the key words in the Band 6 criteria that you'll find in both of these exam mark schemes, they are phrases like close textual analysis to get in the top band, showing insight, bing, when that kind of insight light bulb goes off in your response. The fact that they're exploratory, so detailed within the time that you got. The idea that you can have imaginative interpretation within your response, and the fact that perhaps you manage to be evaluative, which obviously means sort of balancing and weighing up your viewpoints at the end. So if I go through each of those really and try and give you a better idea of how you would incorporate and address those particular features in your responses. The first thing, I've talked a little bit about this in another clip, connotations of words, is basically close textual analysis. Well, one of the things, as I said before, that you can do is talk about the connotations of words. You don't necessarily need to spend hours using loads of terminology. Terminology looks good, but you can convince an examiner that you're doing close textual analysis by simply unpicking and analysing, exploring and explaining the effects of individual words. If you know the word class, then whether it's a noun or an adjective or a verb, brilliant. But if you don't, you can simply talk in detail about what that word connotes, how it makes us feel as a reader. Otherwise, you can convince the examiner that you are being analytical, is to pick out not just single words, but imagery. So it might be a phrase, a simile, a metaphor, the idea that there's patterns of imagery within a text. So animal imagery, for instance, or light and dark within a poem, or the lexical field of violence. So you're picking up on groups of words or phrases that create powerful patterns of images in our mind, and you're really exploring and explaining how they have or create their effect. You could talk in terms of analysis about syntax, the idea of the order of words. So syntactically, the poem Bayonet Charge opens with the word suddenly. So the fact that Hughes has placed that adverb right at the beginning of the poem, beginning of that line, syntactically has quite a powerful effect. If he'd reordered that line and put it in a different order, it wouldn't have the same sort of confusing effect on the reader. Again, I've done another clip on this individually, but phonology, particularly with the poetry exam, but you could bring in phonology in the modern text Unit 1, but I'd be wary of phonology. It's easy to pick out things that aren't really there with phonology, but if you have got harsh alliterative sounds, plosives, or softer assonant sounds, and you think you can convince an examiner that they are playing a part in the emotive impact of a line or a phrase, then that's another way of unpicking and explaining and analysing. The second point being exploratory, the fact that you've got to develop your explanations in detail. Well, one of the ways you can force yourself really to do that, I would say, is by forcing yourself to use these four connectives, or some of these four connectives, regularly for each point that you make. So forcing yourself to say furthermore, or in addition, or therefore, or consequently. Okay, so adding information or explaining information is going to force the examiner again to think that you're exploring detail. There's the old adage that you should talk a lot about a little in literature exams. You can get an A star, I would say, by talking about 3 or 4 quotes if you do so in a very, very convincing way. Sometimes it's good to embed short quotes as well along the way, but close analysis of 3 or 4 quotes, and you can convince the examiner that you are being exploratory if you manage to talk a lot about those quotes. Showing insight is probably a trickier thing, but one of the ways, I know it when I see it in responses, because it's that light bulb moment where a student has learnt something from the text that's a little bit deeper, that's implied within the text but it's not explicit. So from digging through that analysis, they've come to some revelation about an idea within the text. One of the ways you can try and persuade an examiner that you're being insightful, I would say, is talk about how the reader feels, or how you as a modern reader feel about this text. And I don't mean, personally I feel it's a bit boring, or personally I feel it's confusing. That kind of thing is going to kill your response. Examiners want to see students who have engaged with a text. It doesn't necessarily mean you've got to love the text, but if you're going to be critical of it, you've got to be precise and insightful in that critique. So, personally I respond to the text as a modern reader, not by saying you don't like it, but that you feel alienated by the poem Charge of the Light Brigade because of its nationalistic, jingoistic tendencies. That kind of thing might be insightful. The idea that perhaps today a reader is more cynical about sacrifice in wartime, and therefore personally I respond to the text as a modern reader in a more negative way. That kind of thing is insightful. So you don't have to love a poem to be insightful about it. Hopefully, or a text, hopefully some of the texts you do like, but being insightful means that you see more deeply into the poem and you understand it. Being imaginative, I think that's probably the trickiest thing in a piece of analysis. But one of the ways, again, you can do that is by saying something surprising, reading against the grain of the poem. Going back to maybe Charge of the Light Brigade. If you are imaginative about that poem, you might be critical of it as a nationalistic poem that celebrates the sacrifice, the meaningless sacrifice, arguably, of soldiers during the Crimean War. It might be seen as a bit of Victorian pompousness. But I suppose a more imaginative reading might be the idea that actually Tennyson celebrates the ordinary soldier. Perhaps it's possible to take the view that this is actually a far more liberal piece of political propaganda, because he wants us to celebrate the deaths of the ordinary soldiers. And you could argue, or one could hypothesise, that Tennyson wasn't particularly sympathetic towards Lord Cardigan, for instance, who led the charge, an aristocrat who survived the charge and came out a hero. Tennyson wants us to remember all the men, not Cardigan. Cardigan survived, but those unnamed soldiers, those lower class perhaps soldiers who sacrificed themselves for empire every day, and the people at home, working class people, who may have kind of celebrated people like Lord Cardigan, they're not aware of those sacrifices. So saying something imaginative could be just creating a debate about how you could read a poem and offering different angles. Being evaluative, I would say, is including some kind of conclusion at the end. So, and offering a personal reading. So overall, on reflection, I feel the writer. So you've maybe created a debate in an imaginative way, but you then come to some kind of overall evaluative conclusion about how you feel the writer is really presenting ideas. So that's really my guide to how to try and get yourself in that highest band. A lot of it is actually written style, but I would say going back to that adage or maxim of saying a lot about a little is crucial.